He thought embarrassing her in front of everyone would prove his authority, but he had no idea he was about to lose it all in a single moment. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below, and if you believe respect should never depend on appearances, make sure to like and subscribe. These stories remind us what dignity really looks like. Now, back to Emily Carter. The conference room on the 27th floor gleamed under soft white lighting, glass walls reflecting rows of tailored suits and polished shoes. The quiet hum of ambition filling the air as executives reviewed quarterly numbers projected across a massive screen. At the far end of the room stood Daniel Brooks, regional manager, his navy suit crisp, his voice sharp, the kind of man who measured worth in titles and appearances. He adjusted his cufflinks as he scanned the room, pausing briefly when his eyes landed on Emily Carter, who stood near the door, quietly wiping down a glass panel with a cloth, her gray uniform simple, her presence almost invisible to everyone except him. Emily moved with quiet precision, her head slightly lowered, her expression calm, as if she had mastered the art of not being seen. To most in that room, she was just part of the background, another employee whose name they never learned, someone who existed only in the margins of their busy, important lives. But Daniel noticed her differently, not with curiosity, but with irritation, as if her quiet existence somehow challenged the image of control he worked so hard to maintain. As the meeting paused for a technical reset, Daniel exhaled sharply, tapping the table with impatience before turning toward Emily with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You," he called out, his voice cutting through the room, instantly pulling every gaze toward her. The air shifted. Conversation stopped. Emily paused mid-motion, slowly turning to face him, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. "Since you're already here," Daniel continued, stepping closer, his tone laced with mock politeness, "maybe you can help us with something." A few people exchanged glances, sensing the shift from business to something else, something uncomfortable. "We've been reviewing some financial inconsistencies," he said, gesturing toward the screen. "And I'm curious, do you even understand what you're looking at when you clean this room?" Every day, a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the table, subtle, restrained, but unmistakable. Emily didn't respond. She simply held his gaze, her silence stretching just long enough to make a few people shift in their seats. Daniel tilted his head, pressing further. "Or is it all just numbers to you?" he added, his voice louder now, inviting the room to join in the moment. Someone chuckled. Another looked down. The tension thickened, hanging in the air like something waiting to break. Emily lowered the cloth in her hand, folding it neatly, her movements slow, deliberate, almost as if she were taking her time on purpose. Then she looked up again, meeting Daniel's eyes with a calm that didn't match the situation. And in that stillness, something changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The room didn't know it yet, but the moment Daniel chose to turn her into a joke was the exact moment everything began to turn against him. Emily Carter did not flinch, did not rush, did not offer the kind of nervous apology Daniel Brooks clearly expected from someone in her position. Instead, she stood there with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though she had stepped into a moment she had already seen before. The faint hum of the projector filled the silence, and somewhere near the far end of the table, a pen tapped once, then stopped. Daniel's smile tightened, just slightly, the kind of subtle shift only someone watching closely would notice. He had expected discomfort, maybe embarrassment, something that would confirm the invisible hierarchy he relied on. But Emily's calm did not fit the script. "Well?" he pressed, his voice carrying a sharper edge now, as if the room itself needed to be reminded who was in control. Emily's eyes moved briefly toward the screen, where rows of figures and projections glowed in precise alignment, then back to him. "I understand enough," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but it did not waver, and that alone created a ripple that passed through the room like a change in air pressure. A few executives exchanged quick glances, uncertain whether to lean into the moment or retreat from it. Daniel let out a short laugh, louder this time, inviting the room to join him again. "You understand enough?" he repeated, stepping closer, one hand resting on the edge of the table. "That is interesting, because some of the people in this room have spent years learning to read those numbers. Another small wave of polite laughter followed, though this time it was thinner, less certain. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward the table, each step measured, her shoes making the faintest sound against the polished floor. The movement itself drew attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unexpected. No one had invited her closer. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised, but he did not stop her. He assumed control was still his. That assumption lingered in the air, unchallenged for just a second too long. Emily reached the side of the table and placed the folded cloth down with care, aligning it neatly beside a stack of printed reports. Then she looked at the screen again, her gaze tracing across the columns with quiet familiarity. The discrepancy is in the third quarter allocation, she said, almost conversationally. The room did not react at first, as if the words had not fully landed. Daniel's smile froze, just for a fraction of a second, before he forced a chuckle. "Is that so?" he replied, though there was something less certain beneath the surface now. Emily nodded once, her expression unchanged. The projected growth assumes a consistent supplier rate, but the adjustment made in August was not applied to the forecast model. Her tone remained even, almost detached, as if she were describing something obvious. This time, the silence that followed was different. It was not awkward. It was attentive. Heads turned back toward the screen. Someone shifted forward in their chair. Daniel's hand tightened slightly against the table, though he kept his posture steady. "That is a bold observation," he said carefully. Emily met his eyes again, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. "It is not an observation," she replied. "It is a mistake." And just like that, the balance in the room began to tilt, so subtly that only a few could feel it, but enough that Daniel Brooks, for the first time that morning, realized he might not be the one controlling what happened next. The word mistake did not echo loudly, but it settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, as if every person present felt it land at the same time, yet no one dared to acknowledge it first. Daniel Brooks held his position at the head of the table, his expression carefully composed, but something behind his eyes flickered, something sharper now, something calculating. He let out a slow breath, straightening his posture as though reclaiming the space by force of presence alone. "That is a serious claim," he said, his tone measured, controlled, but no longer amused. The faint confidence that had once colored his voice had thinned, replaced by something tighter, something more deliberate. Emily Carter did not move. She stood beside the table, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady, as if the shift in tone had been expected all along. Around the room, the executives leaned forward almost imperceptibly, their attention no longer scattered but focused, drawn into a moment that had quietly transformed from spectacle into scrutiny. The screen behind them continued to display the quarterly projections, rows of data now carrying a new tension, as if the numbers themselves were waiting to be questioned. Daniel turned slightly toward the display, gesturing with a controlled motion. "Then perhaps you would like to explain it," he said, the invitation framed as a challenge, his voice just loud enough to remind the room that he was still in charge. A few people shifted in their seats, sensing the escalation, sensing that what had begun as a moment of public embarrassment was no longer following a predictable path. Emily stepped closer to the table, her movements unhurried, her focus directed toward the data rather than the people watching her. The supplier rate adjustment in August reduced the cost basis by approximately 8%, she said, her voice calm, precise, as if she were reciting something deeply familiar. But the forecast model continues to project using the previous rate, which inflates the third quarter expense line. There was no hesitation in her delivery, no searching for words, only a steady flow of clarity that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty beginning to ripple through the room. One of the senior analysts, a man seated near the center, leaned forward and quickly scanned the report in front of him, his brow tightening as he cross-checked the figures. Another executive glanced at her laptop, fingers moving across the keyboard as she pulled up the August data revision. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was active, filled with quiet verification, with minds working, with attention shifting away from Daniel and toward the numbers. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his composure intact. "And you are confident in that assessment?" he asked, though the question carried less authority now and more need for reassurance. Emily turned her head just enough to meet his gaze again. Yes, she said simply. No elaboration. No defense. Just certainty. The analyst at the table cleared his throat, breaking the silence. She is right, he said, his voice careful, almost reluctant, as if acknowledging the truth required stepping outside the expected order of things. The August adjustment was not carried forward into the projection model. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Heads nodded. Eyes shifted. The balance had changed, and everyone could feel it now. Daniel's hand dropped from the table, his fingers curling slightly, as if searching for control that no longer responded the way it had just minutes before. For the first time, the room was not looking to him for direction. They were looking at her. And in that moment, the authority he had tried to assert began to unravel, not through confrontation, but through something far more unsettling. Truth, delivered without fear, without force, and without asking for permission. The acknowledgement from the analyst did not raise his voice, yet it carried farther than anything Daniel Brooks had said that morning, settling across the polished table and into every attentive silence that followed. The room shifted, not abruptly, but with a quiet realignment of attention that Daniel could feel without needing to look. For the first time since the meeting began, he was no longer the center of certainty. He adjusted his stance, drawing in a controlled breath, his mind moving quickly, searching for a way to reframe the moment before it slipped entirely beyond his reach. That may be a minor oversight, he said, his tone firm, attempting to regain ground through dismissal rather than denial. It does not change the overall trajectory. The words were delivered with practiced confidence, but they lacked the ease he had carried earlier. Emily Carter remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not compete for attention, but somehow held it anyway. She glanced once more at the screen, then back toward the table, her expression composed, almost thoughtful. It changes more than the trajectory, she said quietly. Her voice did not rise, yet it reached every corner of the room. It changes the margin projections for the next 2 quarters, and it affects the allocation decisions that follow. A faint pause settled after her words, not empty, but filled with calculation, as several executives began revisiting their reports with renewed focus. One of them leaned back slightly, exhaling as if reconsidering assumptions that had seemed solid only moments ago. Another adjusted her glasses, scrolling through data with a growing sense of urgency. The shift was no longer subtle. It was unfolding in real time. Daniel's gaze moved briefly across the room, registering the change, the way attention had drifted, the way authority had begun to redistribute itself without asking for permission. He turned back to Emily, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath his control. "And how exactly would you know that?" he asked, the question sharpened now, no longer casual, no longer rhetorical. It was not just a challenge. It was a test, an attempt to reestablish the line between who belonged at the table and who did not. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. There was no defiance in her eyes, no need to push against him. Only clarity. "Because I worked on the original model," she said. The sentence landed softly, but its impact was immediate. A few heads lifted at once. Someone stopped typing. The faint sound of the projector seemed louder in the sudden stillness. Daniel blinked once, processing, his mind catching on the implication before the words fully settled. "That is not possible," he replied quickly, almost reflexively, though the certainty he intended did not quite carry through. Emily did not respond right away. Instead, she reached toward the stack of printed reports beside her and gently slid one forward, turning it so the heading faced the table. Her finger rested lightly on a line near the bottom of the page. "The initial framework was drafted 18 months ago," she said, her tone steady. "Before the restructuring." One of the executives leaned in, scanning the document, then paused as recognition crossed his face. "Carter," he read aloud under his breath, almost to himself. The name seemed to travel through the room, connecting something unseen, something overlooked. Daniel's expression held, but only just. The pieces were beginning to align in ways he had not anticipated, and the confidence he had relied on now felt less like control and more like something slipping through his grasp. Around him, The room was no longer reacting to his cues. It was responding to her presence, her knowledge, her quiet authority that had not been announced but was now impossible to ignore. And in that slow, undeniable shift, the moment he had created to diminish her had become something else entirely, something he could no longer direct, no longer contain, as the truth continued to unfold with a calm that made it impossible to interrupt. The name lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, as if the room itself needed time to reconcile what it had just heard with what it had chosen to ignore moments before. Carter. It was no longer just a name attached to a quiet presence in the background. It was a connection, a thread pulling the past into the present with quiet precision. Daniel Brooks stood still, his posture rigid, his mind moving faster than his expression allowed, trying to reorganize the narrative before it fully slipped away from him. "There are many Carters," he said, his voice measured but thinner now, as if the certainty he once carried had begun to fracture. It was not a denial. It was a delay. Emily Carter did not rush to respond. She simply reached for the report again, flipping it open with calm familiarity, her fingers moving to a section marked with annotations that were precise, deliberate, unmistakably professional. "Section 4, subsection B," she said softly, turning the page toward the table. "Cost stabilization model. The adjustment framework was designed to account for supplier volatility beyond 6% variance." Her words were not defensive. They were factual, grounded, and delivered with the kind of clarity that did not seek approval. Around the table, eyes followed her gesture, scanning the document with a focus that had shifted completely away from Daniel. One of the senior executives leaned closer, his brow tightening as recognition deepened. "This is the original architecture," he murmured, almost to himself. Another nodded slowly, tracing the annotations with a finger. "We used this to restructure the entire forecasting system last year." The realization spread quietly, not through dramatic reactions, but through subtle changes in posture, in attention, in the way people began to look at Emily not as an interruption, but as a source. Daniel felt it, the shift, the way the room no longer moved with him but around him, as if he had become a step behind a process he once controlled. He straightened slightly, his jaw set, searching for something to anchor himself to. "If that were true," he said carefully, choosing each word with intention, "you would not be here." The sentence trailed just enough to reveal its meaning without needing to complete it. The implication hung in the air, fragile, uncertain. Emily met his gaze again, her expression unchanged, but there was something deeper now, something that carried a quiet weight of experience rather than reaction. "Roles change," she said simply. No explanation, no justification, just a truth that did not require elaboration. The room fell still again, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding beginning to form. One of the executives leaned back slowly, exhaling as he looked from the report to Emily. "Why was this not flagged earlier?" he asked, though the question was no longer directed at her. It moved across the table, searching, redirecting responsibility. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came immediately. For the first time, he was not ready. The momentum had shifted too far, too fast, and the structure he relied on no longer held the same weight. Emily did not step forward. She did not claim the moment. She simply stood where she was, her presence steady, her role undefined, yet undeniable. And in that quiet restraint, in that refusal to dominate the space she had just redefined, the contrast became undeniable. Authority, once loud and unquestioned, had faltered, and something far more powerful had taken its place, not through force, but through truth that spoke for itself, leaving Daniel Brooks standing in a silence he could no longer control. The question did not need to be answered immediately for its impact to be felt, because the silence that followed had already begun assigning responsibility without a single name being spoken. The executives at the table shifted their attention again, this time not toward Emily Carter, but across documents, across screens, across the chain of decisions that had led them here. It was no longer about whether there was a mistake. It was about how it had gone unnoticed, and more importantly, who had allowed it to remain that way. Daniel Brooks felt the weight of that shift settle in, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building beneath the surface. He straightened his shoulders, drawing in a controlled breath, forcing his expression back into something resembling authority, though it now required effort rather than instinct. "We are not here to assign blame," he said, his tone firm, attempting to redirect the room, to contain the direction of thought before it moved too far beyond him. "We are here to focus on solutions." The words were structured, practiced, but they no longer carried the same influence. They sounded like a correction, not a command. Emily did not interrupt. She did not challenge him. She simply listened, her gaze steady, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to do and why it would not hold. One of the executives, a woman seated near the end of the table, leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she reviewed the timeline on her tablet. "The August adjustment was approved at the regional level," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful, precise. "Which means it should have been integrated before the final projection review." Her eyes lifted, not to Emily, but to Daniel. The connection did not need to be spoken. It was already understood. Daniel felt it, the way attention settled on him, not aggressively, not accusingly, but with a quiet expectation that demanded clarity. He opened his mouth, but paused for just a fraction too long, enough for the hesitation to register. "The integration process involves multiple checkpoints," he replied, his voice steady but slightly tighter than before. "It is possible that the update was delayed during the transition period." It was a reasonable explanation. It was also incomplete. The analyst who had spoken earlier glanced down at his screen again, then back up, his expression more certain now. "The transition period ended 2 months before the final model was locked," he said, his tone careful but firm. The words did not confront Daniel directly, but they closed the space around his explanation, narrowing it, tightening it. The room grew still again, but this time it was not waiting. It was concluding. Emily remained where she was, her presence unchanged, yet it had become something central, something that anchored the conversation without demanding it. She had not accused anyone. She had not raised her voice. She had simply placed the truth in the room and allowed it to unfold. Daniel's hand moved slightly along the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the polished surface as if searching for something solid to hold on to. But the control he had relied on earlier was no longer there. It had shifted, quietly, steadily, into something he could not command back. Across the table, the executives were no longer looking for direction. They were looking for accountability. And for the first time that morning, Daniel Brooks stood not as the one asking the questions, but as the one expected to answer them, in a room that had grown silent not out of respect, but out of recognition that the truth had already begun to speak louder than anything he could say. The silence no longer waited for Daniel Brooks to recover. It pressed against him, steady and unyielding, as if the room itself had decided to move forward without his permission. Every pair of eyes that had once followed his lead now held a different expectation, one that did not rely on his authority, but questioned it. He adjusted his stance again, but this time the movement felt smaller, less certain, as though even the space around him had begun to shrink. "We can revisit the integration logs," he said, his voice controlled, but the effort behind it now visible. "There may be a technical explanation that has not yet been identified." It was an attempt to redirect, to introduce complexity where clarity had already taken root. But the room did not follow. The woman at the end of the table shook her head slightly, her eyes still on her tablet. "The logs have already been reviewed," she replied calmly. There was no delay in the system. The data was simply not updated. Her words did not accuse, but they closed another path, narrowing the space Daniel had left to maneuver. The analyst beside her leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table as he spoke. "Which means the projection was approved with incomplete data." The statement settled into the room with quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but precise. The kind of truth that did not need emphasis to carry weight. Daniel's jaw tightened again, and this time he did not immediately respond. The rhythm of the meeting had shifted beyond his control, and every attempt to regain it only seemed to highlight how far it had already moved. Across from him, Emily Carter remained still, her presence unchanged, yet it now defined the center of the moment. She had not interrupted, had not pushed, had not claimed anything for herself. She had simply revealed what was already there and allowed it to stand. One of the senior executives leaned back slowly, his gaze moving between Daniel and the report in front of him. This affects more than projections, he said, his tone thoughtful but firm. It affects decision-making at every level tied to these numbers. Another voice followed, quieter but just as steady, and it raises questions about oversight. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet they carried direction all the same. Daniel felt the weight of them settle, not as an immediate confrontation, but as something more difficult to counter. A collective understanding. He placed his hand on the table again, this time not to assert control, but to steady himself, his fingers pressing lightly against the polished surface. For a moment, he looked as though he might speak, might attempt one more explanation, one more shift. But no words came, because there was nothing left to redirect, nothing left to reframe. The structure he had built his authority on had already been examined, and it had not held. The room did not need him to speak anymore. It had already moved past that point. And in that quiet, irreversible shift, Daniel Brooks stood at the center of a silence that no longer belonged to him, while Emily Carter, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, had become the one presence no one in the room could ignore. No one spoke immediately, because there was nothing left that needed to be proven, only something that needed to be acknowledged. The numbers on the screen had not changed, the reports had not rewritten themselves, and yet everything in the room felt different, as if a layer of assumption had been quietly removed, revealing something far less comfortable beneath it. Daniel Brooks stood at the head of the table, his presence still physically central, but no longer influential in the way it had been at the start of the meeting. His shoulders remained squared, his posture disciplined, but the ease that once defined him had disappeared, replaced by a stillness that felt less like control and more like containment. Across from him, one of the senior executives closed his folder slowly, the sound soft but deliberate, drawing attention without intention. "We need to correct this immediately," he said, his voice steady, not directed at Daniel alone, but the implication was clear. The projections must be revised before any further decisions are made. Another executive nodded, already making notes, her focus sharp, efficient. "And the oversight process needs to be reviewed," she added, her tone calm but firm. "This cannot happen again." The conversation moved forward, but not in the direction Daniel had set. It flowed around him, through him, without pausing for his input, as if the authority he once held had been quietly bypassed. Emily Carter remained where she stood, her presence unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression composed. She did not step into the conversation, did not insert herself into the decisions now being made. She had already done what needed to be done. The room did not need more from her. And yet, it was clear to everyone that none of this would be happening without her. One of the executives glanced toward her, then back to the others. "We should bring her into the review process," he said, almost as an afterthought, though the weight of the suggestion was anything but casual. "She clearly understands the system at a foundational level." There was no disagreement, only quiet acceptance. Daniel's eyes shifted toward Emily for a brief moment, the look subtle, difficult to define. It was not anger. It was not disbelief. It was something closer to realization, though it came too late to change anything. He had misjudged her completely, not just her role, but her presence, her understanding, her place in a system he thought he controlled. And now that misjudgment stood exposed, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to deny. Evidence. The executive at the head of the table turned slightly toward Emily, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said simply. The words were quiet, but they carried a respect that had been absent at the beginning of the meeting. Emily returned the nod, just as subtle, her expression unchanged, as if the recognition did not alter her in the way it might have altered someone else. She did not seek validation. She did not hold on to the moment. She simply accepted it and let it pass. The room began to shift again, not with tension this time, but with purpose, as discussions moved toward solutions, corrections, next steps. Papers were gathered, screens adjusted, voices lowered into focused collaboration. And through it all, Daniel Brooks remained still for just a moment longer than everyone else, his silence no longer commanding, no longer strategic, but reflective of something he could not immediately resolve. Because in a single meeting, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Emily Carter had done what no title, no position, no authority in that room had managed to do. She had changed the direction of the truth. And the room, once guided by hierarchy, now moved by something else entirely. The meeting did not end with a dramatic announcement or a raised voice. It ended the way truth often settles into a room, quietly, steadily, leaving behind a shift that no one could ignore even as they gathered their papers and closed their laptops. Chairs moved softly against the floor, conversations resumed in low, focused tones, but the energy had changed, and everyone knew it. Emily Carter picked up the cloth she had set aside earlier, folding it once more with the same care she had shown before any of this began, as if the moment that had just unfolded was simply another part of her day. She did not linger. She did not wait for acknowledgement beyond what had already been given. She turned slightly, preparing to return to the role everyone had assumed defined her, the quiet figure at the edge of the room. "Emily," a voice called, stopping her just before she reached the door. She paused, turning back, her expression calm, attentive. The senior executive who had spoken earlier stood now, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "We would like you to stay," he said, his tone respectful, without hesitation. "Your insight is not just helpful, it is necessary." The words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were genuine. Around the room, several heads nodded in agreement, not out of obligation, but recognition. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, then gave a small nod in return. No smile, no display of triumph, just quiet acceptance. She stepped back toward the table, not as someone reclaiming a position, but as someone who had never truly been out of place to begin with. Across from her, Daniel Brooks remained standing, his hands resting lightly against the table, his eyes lowered for a moment as if recalibrating something internal that had been shaken loose. When he finally looked up, his gaze moved toward Emily, and this time there was no trace of dismissal, no attempt to reassert control. Only a quiet acknowledgement, difficult, but undeniable. "I was not aware," he said, his voice measured, stripped of the sharp edges it once carried. The sentence was incomplete, but it did not need to be finished. Emily met his eyes, her expression unchanged, but her presence now carried something different, something that did not rely on titles or positions. "You were not looking," she replied softly. The words were not harsh. They were not accusatory. They were simply true. And in that truth, there was no room for argument. The room fell silent one last time, not with tension, but with understanding. Because what had happened was no longer just about a mistake in numbers or a failure in process. It was about something deeper, something that could not be corrected with a revised report or a new projection. It was about the way people are seen or not seen, and the cost of assuming that silence means absence. Daniel did not respond. He did not need to. The realization had already settled in, and it carried more weight than any defense he could offer. Around them, the meeting resumed its forward motion, now guided by clarity rather than assumption, by attention rather than hierarchy. And Emily Carter, who had walked into the room as someone easily overlooked, remained at the table not because she demanded it, but because she had shown, without raising her voice, that she had always belonged there. And that day, without a single moment of force, the room remembered something it had almost forgotten, that respect is not given to those who speak the loudest, but to those who see what others refuse to notice, and have the courage to let the truth stand on its own.